Hello. I just want to kind of follow up with this particular lecture. Well, I would just call this a um, touch base. Okay, I'm just touching base because I don't really have anything solid yet. Okay, but I do want to share with you what I have been thinking about and what the plan is. So what I want to do, because a lot of professors would at this point, teach you how to make a form, how to make some complex input, and stuff like that, and stash things into a database. What I want to do is to talk about authentication first. Okay, how do you make sure that whoever gains access to the content, and what content are we gonna permit the other person to gain access to. So I want to focus on that because that actually is very important in any website design these days. So I am going to focus on authentication, or how do we keep track of a session? What is the concept of a session? Because once we sign in, we begin a session, and during that session, all further use cases of a particular website is going to assume a certain person's identity or certain user's identity, and that will give that person access to certain content and certain permissions to do certain things. So how do we establish that identity? That's authentication. And in the process of talking about authentication, we'll talk about how to create forms. I'm pretty sure your previous class, the HTML class, must have talked about forms already. And in this case, the registration form should be fairly simple, okay? Because all we need is really just a identification of some kind, and we can probably even allow the use of several different means, but I have to be careful about which one we should use, because the Power Server does not actually have an email server attached to it. It's just we just couldn't get it set up for security purposes. So we kind of have to think about what to do with within the registration process, in terms of what we can use for authentication purposes, and then obviously we need another form for people to sign back into the system to authenticate and go like, I'm tag, and this is my credentials. Okay. Um, we'll talk about the site administrator. How do we first establish the site administrator so that that particular identity can sign in, and initially, so that that person can do all the administration through the web interface. Now we can also do a lot of administration directly with the database. So the mechanism to do all of this stuff here, just so that I add a little bit more here. So we need connection to the database, which in our case is going to be MariaDB, which is basically MySQL. We also need the concept of sessions. And fortunately, all of this stuff here, once we have connectivity to a database, the illusion of a session is fairly automatic within the Express framework. So there's not a whole lot of stuff that we need to do, and we can store session variables pretty conveniently. So when we get to that point, we'll talk about what a session is, how to make use of a database, and how we can potentially utilize multi-factor authentication. So there are all of these topics that I'm going to bring up next. What I have not decided is how we are going to do the multi-factor authentication. Because one thing I don't want to do is to store passwords on any particular website, because if you allow your end users or clients to store their password on your site, and you somehow lost the passwords to a hacker, then you are going to be very much liable to that theft of passwords and identities. So we don't want to do that. We want to basically avoid having to take on that liability if it is possible. So what we can do is to store other access information. So I'll give you an example. Okay, so let's just say that we store a cell phone number associated with a username. So that can be stolen, but it is not going to allow a third person to be able to sign in, because with multi-factor authentication, what the site is going to do is to say, I'm going to send a secret code, okay, a 6-digit number for instance, to that text, and then the person who's trying to authenticate will have to look at the text and enter the 6-digit number in order to be able to sign in. So in this scenario, someone who can break into the database and grab all the identities along with the passwords, I mean, not passwords, the cell phone numbers in this case, yes, it is still bad, but it is not quite as bad as stealing the actual passwords to to whatever website that you're creating. The problem is to generate text messages. Um, it's not like it's not possible, but you need to learn how to do a fairly complex thing called using an API. It's a post API. No, it's called a risk. There we go. It's a risk. Oh, I cannot remember the acronym. So it's an API where it allows one website to contact another website for service. So we can use um, Twilio, which is a resource that we can use for scripting. It allows an interface. Okay, it boils down to the point that your website written in JavaScript would be able to send and receive text messages to your customers. Okay, so that's a fantastic thing to do, but the complexity is, I would say, it's not appropriate for this class. Okay, so that's out of the that's not doable. Okay, the second one would be email. Okay, and that is a little bit out of we can't do that either because the power server does not have a SMTP server, and without an SMTP server, it basically means that we cannot send email. And if we cannot send email from the power server, then what we can do with two-factor authentication is going to be very limited. So that is also, kind of out of the. It's not something that we can do. So I still have to think about the authentication piece, because I know ways to get around both problems. The question is about the complexity. Okay, is it going to be a little bit too complex for what we are trying to learn in this class? So I have that to ponder upon. But as I'm pondering upon those things, we are going to go ahead and create the forms. We're going to talk about how to connect to the database, and we're going to talk about the concept of a session. So in the beginning, we're gonna do some really kind of hokey, low security or no security type of way for authentication, and then as time goes on, we might switch to the two or multi-factor authentication method. All right, so as I said, this is just me touching base with the class, letting you guys know that I am thinking about what the next step should be, and there's no doubt that we are going to get into these, kind of low-level mechanisms. But it might take me a little bit more time to plan for the multi-factor authentication piece because it has to do with the limited mechanisms available to the power server and what we can do with other sites. So I probably will end up doing something more along the line of having myself to implement a easy to use interface to either Google web script or some other mechanism for that purpose. So I'm gonna work that part out. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it. I will work it out, but the next lab is most likely going to be about connecting to the database and having the concept of a session, and also creating forms and then collecting all the information from a form. And then the one after that is going to make use of the forms and also the database connection in order for us to perform the authentication piece. So that's kind of the plan for the near future. And then after that, after we have authentication, after we can sign people in, then we can go places with storing data, and because now we can control access to the data. All right, so that's all I have for now, and I am going to upload this so that you guys have a little update from me because I don't want you guys to think that I'm not on the ball, I'm not on the job. I am, but I still need some time to plan for basically what to do next.